patent clerk, Newtonian physics. Intellectual property really has been, for hundreds of years now, kind of a core part of how people both monetize and protect. And it's been interesting watching disruptive technologies, specifically cryptocurrency, which isn't really governed by patents or can't really be controlled by patents. And on the other hand, you've got things like 3D printing that made a lot of progress in just a couple of years, but it was only because some 20-year-old patents had expired, and now these parts were able to be made by just anybody who wanted to make them, as opposed to the one manufacturing conglomerate that had the legal right to be able to do it before that point. So I'm curious, where do you think intellectual property controls can fit within a Bitcoin framework, and what impact would it have had if the situation had been different in the cryptocurrency space?
So my own feeling on intellectual property is that it's basically an artificial thing that can only exist in an age of the nation state, and that's governed by the physical world and the capacity of monopolistic elites to control the world through compulsion and coercion. And that's fundamentally at odds with which the digital age is all about malleability, reproducibility, immortality, and distributed networks. And these are just the idea of some elites, gathering together to allocate who owns what in the realm of ideas incompatible with this. And it's crazy. I've done a lot of work on the history of intellectual property, the ideological structures surrounding it. It wasn't really until after the beginning of the 21st century that we saw hardcore, really serious attacks on the idea of IP. Now, it's because the digital networks really just kind of broke the system down. We saw some opposition to IP even as early as the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, but nothing really substantial and serious until the digital age. Basically, I think the system is broken down and isn't going to last. And it's very interesting to me, too, to see how large corporations are starting to realize this and stop putting so much energy and time into enforcing their patents and their copyrights, and starting to use the new networks of open source cooperation and the sharing economy to their advantage.
Here. That's a great comment, Jeffrey. Intellectual property is an artificial construct for monopolizing ideas and creating cartels around abstract concepts. The basic problem is that no one really has an original thought that they conceived completely by themselves without anybody else being involved. Innovation is simply extending the culture of 4.5 million years 1 millimeter forward by combining all of the existing inputs and producing something slightly different, something that probably a few thousand other people have already done somewhere else. And the idea that you can take that and create a monopoly around it is, while originally envisioned as a way to reward creators, has ended up creating these islands of stagnant creativity and isolation by removing things from the culture. The age-old compact, if you like, the social compact that's even encoded in the U.S. Constitution, which is that Congress can secure, rights for creators in order to promote the arts and sciences. This idea that these patents and copyrights are of limited time, so that you take from the cultural zeitgeist, you enhance it or advance it a tiny bit, you get a short-term reward, and then you give it back to the public domain so that others can build upon it. And that compact then got perverted, starting with the Disney company, who, as soon as they saw their Mickey copyright running out, went to Congress and got it extended 73 times until copyright essentially became infinite instead of limited times. Quite happy to take the Brothers Grimm and every other cultural story, appropriate it for their own needs, and then give nothing back to the popular culture, right? Take all of the stories of our ancestors, turn them into copyright material, and then give nothing back by perverting the copyright law. And we've seen this happen across the board in intellectual property. Well, open source breaks that cycle, and it recognizes that collaboration and creation moves faster, and innovation with collaboration moves faster. And if you give back to the community will give back to you again and again, and it creates this feedback loop of accelerating innovation, whether it's Linux or Wikipedia or 1,000 other things that have come from it, especially now with the introduction of the Creative Commons law and licenses. Those are amazing things, and what they're showing is that there's a much better way to do it.
I heard something last night that really intrigued me, because I've tried to understand like the best way to describe open source projects and what they mean. At the Bitcoin meetup last night, somebody said that the great thing about open source technology is that it sort of takes away the obligation we all feel to sort of constantly reinvent things, to constantly recreate on our own from scratch. All things, always reinventing the wheel in a world of intellectual property, as you say, requires absolute originality. But open source programming and open source everything allows us to sort of draw from the energies of others and take what's already been done and sort of build on top of them. So you have this sort of accumulating capital that grows over time. I was trying to think of the right analogy. It's like as if you had a cake that is just constantly sort of one cake baked by the whole world that's constantly getting ever better and ever more delicious, and the more people eat it, there's ever more cake for ever more people, rather than just sort of individual cakes built by individuals constantly throughout history. You have sort of one big cake that everybody's constantly making better and testing and bringing their own ideas to it. I thought that was a really nice way to think about it.
Yeah, the core fallacy at the heart of the concept of intellectual property is the word property, because one of the absolute characteristics of property is that if you have property and I take that property, you no longer have that property. It is by definition singular, unique, unitary, and not shareable. But if you have an idea and I copy that idea, we both have that idea. And if I give it to 10 more people, all 12 of us now have that idea, and we can all build on it. And you lost nothing from the fact that I have the idea. It's not property. And it's not property because it's not tangible, it's not destroyable, it's infinitely copyable. If you have invented something and I copy that, then really what we're doing is doubling the rate of invention, because at the end of the day, you didn't really invent something. You just expanded on thousands of years of culture. And your addition is standing on the shoulders of giants. Hasn't really raised the bar that much.
The whole idea of property in the first place, as you say, comes about because of the existence of scarcity. I mean, it's a social construct we invented to stop conflicts, to deal with the problem of rivalrous control over the physical world. Once you migrate to the digital world and you get simultaneous consumption of all things with no depreciation of the original object, property is no longer necessary. It becomes just an absurdity. It's important to remember that in history, people have had mistaken views of property over all sorts of things. For example, in the 18th century and up until the early part of the 19th century, people widely thought that slaves were legitimate forms of property. In fact, there's a Fifth Amendment of the Constitution was put in there to protect those property rights over other people, and now we recognize that was just a mistake. So in the 21st century, we're gradually realizing this is also a mistake to apply the term property to the realm of ideas.
But was it always a mistake? Because the arguments I hear both of you making basically revolve around now we have digital things, but that wasn't true even 30 or 40 years ago. So 200 years ago, when intellectual property was getting started in this country, in the United States, I have it in my head that it actually might have served a purpose, because the inventor, was at the mercy of a manufacturing partner that might take years and might actually kick them out of the business because they don't control, the inventor doesn't control or have any claim to the very centralized and capital-intensive means of production. So Lincoln had a quote that I like. He said, "Patents added the fuel of interest to the fire of innovations." And I wonder, did they ever serve a purpose in your eyes, Jeffrey?
I don't think so. And I think what we need to do is totally revise intellectual history. The origin of the steam engine was a similar kind of problem. I mean, there was a great innovation, then it got locked down by patents, and nothing happened of any value for another 10 or 20 years because everybody was sort of prohibited by law from adding to it. It was very interesting what happened with even things like the cotton gin. Who's that guy? Whitney supposedly invented it, but he didn't invent it. He improved it slightly, and then got a patent on it and went around spending the next 20 years cracking cracking skulls to prevent innovation. He finally learned his lesson after he bankrupted himself, spending much money on patent lawsuits. There's the same thing with the Wright brothers. I mean, they came up with a pretty cool little innovation that they gave them the title of being the first in flight, and then they spent the rest of their whole lives enforcing the patents. Meanwhile, all other countries in the world actually improved airline technology. By the time World War I came along, the U.S. had the worst airplanes in the world because we had the tightest patent controls. Yeah, I don't think the patents have actually ever served any kind of purpose, and we really need to revise our intellectual history. Adam, you said something very interesting about how maybe intellectual property is not really relevant in the digital age, but it might have had relevance before. But I really feel like we should have known that IP was not a good idea, even dating all the way back to the Gutenberg Bible. When the Gutenberg Bible came along, of course, there was no IP over the Psalms and the other texts that were being printed. But there was a confusion because people associated the ideas on the page with the physical property of the page itself. We couldn't really conceptualize the fact that these are really different products. I mean, the ideas in the book are part of the non-scarce realm. The book itself is part of the scarce realm. So we have this kind of merging of these two things, one non-scarce and one scarce, and one beautiful thing called a book. But it took us a long time to sort of realize that we're dealing always with two realms, one scarce and one non-scarce. And we just didn't know it so fully and completely until the last few years.
So Bitcoin emerged as a very hobbyist sort of thing, right? It was very, very amateur, very just experimental. Let's see what we can accomplish. We're doing this because it's neat that we can do this. And I recently read a book called The Master Switch by Tim Wu. And in that, he tells a bunch of different stories of information empires as they succeed and then fail. And one of the stories that he tells is about AM radio and FM radio. And AM radio strikes me very similarly to how Bitcoin emerged, and FM radio seems like maybe after the recent discussion about these rules that are being made in New York, maybe that's the situation that everything that comes after will fall under. So I'm curious, do you know this story?
I'm not aware about it.
It's been a while since I read Tim Wu's book, so maybe you can remind me while we explain it to our listeners.
It's a fairly lengthy thing, but the idea is in the early days, a kid who wanted to set up a radio station could set up a radio station with one of these little crystal radio things, and it was a hobbyist thing that people did because it was fun. You could set up a broadcast and you could listen to things, and this was very new at the time. Basically, it took like 40 years to develop, but by that point, it had developed to quite a successful industry, and there were a variety of monopolies actually, because at the time, the only way that you could get a station from somewhere non-locally would be to use AT&T's long-distance lines, and that actually was one of the reasons why FM radio was kind of suppressed, because FM radio came along and it essentially made it so ranges were such and power requirements were such that before it was unfeasible with AM radio to do like rebroadcast stations where you broadcast from one hill and then it's rebroadcast from another hill. The range was too short and the power requirements were too great. But when FM radio came along, it essentially made it so that anybody who wanted to do this could very cheaply set up these networks of stations and rebroadcasters. And that was one of several reasons why the AM radio paradigm, which had actually invented the FM radio technology, had funded the research to do it, then sat on the technology. And so the FCC came along and said, in order to maintain the standard, you can use much less power than you could with an equivalent AM station so that it will only give you an AM equivalent broadcast distance. I'm rambling and doing a kind of terrible job with this, but it seems like sometimes, especially in the last 100 years, these are used as weapons to suppress technologies.
It's not sometimes, Adam. Every single time in every disruptive technology, the existing industries have used every weapon at their disposal to fight for incumbency and to prevent disruption, which is, of course, a normal reaction, which then tells you what regulation does. Regulation starts off, at least presumably or presented as, consumer protection, and it very quickly becomes a way to distinguish incumbents and to protect them from competition because they become adept at navigating the regulation, they co-opt the regulators, and then as soon as disruption happens, they turn the regulation around and point it as a big weapon at the disruptors, and that has happened in every industry. It's happening today in every industry.
In the end, they never succeed. That's what's amusing. I mean, history progresses in any case. It's just that the regulators can slow us down, but they can't ultimately stop it, which makes it just a vast waste. I feel this way about a lot of these Bitcoin regulations that are coming out. It's like it's going to make the sector function less well. It's going to make it less competitive. There's going to be less focus on the consumer and more focus on compliance, But in the end, 50 years from now, none of these regulations that they're trying to pass right now are going to have any relevance for whether and to what extent Bitcoin adoptions takes place. Bitcoin's going to take its own course eventually. It's just a matter of how many victims you want to create in the meantime. That's what it's all about.
Well, but for New York, for example, again, we're talking about proposed rules here, just real briefly, that essentially say that you have the same compliance requirements if you do anything with Bitcoin and users that have some basis in New York as you would if basically you're a minor bank. Reporting requirements are very, very stringent, and it basically makes it so that with the current way cryptocurrency is, it's kind of incompatible to be compliant and to not create an entirely new cryptocurrency. So I've been wondering about that. I mean, it's kind of easy to create a new cryptocurrency. So if New York wants to go along with this type of means, doesn't it make sense to actually either, maybe not them, maybe somebody else does it, but create a cryptocurrency that actually complies with all of these requirements that they want, that has the real name stuff attached, and that doesn't require you to jerry-rig it, rather than using Bitcoin where, yeah, you can use it, but you're throwing out all the advantages that came with it, so why bother?
I think that's mistaking a feature for a bug. The fact that Bitcoin is incompatible with these regulations, that's not a bug in Bitcoin. That's a feature. That's one of the best features in Bitcoin. It's incompatible with these regulations because those regulations themselves express the existing paradigm, and that is exactly what Bitcoin is disrupting.
But I'm going to call you on this, Andreas, because Bitcoin is neutral. So at the same time, you're kind of putting an ideology onto it that are saying that thing. So that's what I'm saying is Bitcoin has the ideology baked into it. Can you twist that ideology and create something else that's very similar, but that doesn't have that exact thing?
No, what I'm saying is that Bitcoin is neutral, but Bitcoin is neutral in a way that violates the tenets of a very not neutral regulatory system that assumes that the best way to achieve consumer protection is to have all of the personally identifiable information of consumers given to several agencies with lax controls, so they can lord over it and supposedly stop bad guys. And what that does is actually destroys consumer protection, and privacy is consumer protection. The idea that by giving all your private information you will be protected as a consumer is perverse. And the fact that Bitcoin does not conform to that idea because it is neutral, because it allows consumers to interact without having to go through this perverse activity of giving up all their personal information just to transact, that's not a bug in Bitcoin. That is the feature that makes sure that Bitcoin will not fit into these comfortable regulations, and it won't fit into the comfortable regulations because the regulations themselves are perverse. The idea that consumer protection is ensured by taking all the private information of consumers. And when consumers have a choice to choose how they want to be protected, they choose not to give out their personal information.
But that is the point. But that's what they're doing. But I mean, like, yes, in reality, yes, given the choice, but they don't have a choice. If this happens, then the only legal uses for Bitcoin will be this type of use, where you are disclosing all of this information. So that's what I'm saying, is that in the world that we live in, if this happens, is it better to keep using Bitcoin and still disclose all that information, because you're going to have to anyways, if you're in New York and under the subject of all this nonsense? Or is it better to create something that kind of bakes it in? And more importantly, what will people who are not us and who are not in this for the ideology of it think? Thanks for listening to episode 134 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Content for today's episode was provided by AndreasAntonopoulos, JeffreyTucker, and AdamBLevin. This episode was edited by Denise Levine and AdamBLevin. Music for today's show is provided by Jared Rubens, Gertie Beats, and General Fuzz. If you're a developer, you might be interested in our upcoming Coins for Commits program. As the platform goes open source in the coming weeks, we'd like as much help as possible, and you'll earn LTBC for your commits. If you have any questions, send an email to adam@letstalkbitcoin.com, and I'll help you find the right person to speak to.
years 1 millimeter forward by combining all of the existing inputs and producing something slightly different, something that probably a few thousand other people have already done somewhere else. And the idea that you can take that and create a monopoly around it is, while originally envisioned as a way to reward creators, has ended up creating these islands of stagnant creativity and isolation by removing things from the culture. The age-old compact, if you like, the social compact that's even encoded in the U.S. Constitution, which is that
so much energy and time into enforcing their patents and their copyrights and starting to use the new networks of open source cooperation and the sharing economy to their advantage.
Here. That's a great comment, Jeffrey. Intellectual property is an artificial construct for monopolizing ideas and creating cartels around abstract concepts. The basic problem is that no one really has an original thought that they conceived completely by themselves without anybody else being involved. Innovation is simply extending the culture of 4.5 million years.
Patent clerk, Newtonian physics. Intellectual property really has been, for hundreds of years now, kind of a core part of how people both monetize and protect. And it's been interesting watching disruptive technologies, specifically cryptocurrency, which isn't really governed by patents or can't really be controlled by patents. And on the other hand, you've got things like 3D printing that made a lot of progress in just a couple of years, but it was only because some 20-year-old patents had expired, and now these parts were able to be made by just anybody who wanted to make them, as opposed to the one manufacturing conglomerate that had the legal right to be able to do it before that.
The idea of being compatible with this. And it's basically, I've done a lot of work on the history of intellectual property, the ideological structures surrounding it. It wasn't really until after the beginning of the 21st century that we saw hardcore, really serious attacks on the idea of IP. Now, it's because the digital networks really just kind of broke the system down. We saw some opposition to IP even as early as the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, but nothing really substantial and serious until the digital age. Basically, I think the system is broken down and isn't going to last. And it's very interesting to me, too, to see how large corporations are starting to realize this and stop putting point.
So I'm curious, where do you think intellectual property controls can fit within a Bitcoin framework, and what impact would it have had if the situation had been different in the cryptocurrency space?
So my own feeling on intellectual property is that it's basically an artificial thing that can only exist in an age of the nation state, and that's governed by the physical world and the capacity of monopolistic elites to control the world through compulsion and coercion. And that's fundamentally at odds with which the digital age is all about malleability, reproducibility, immortality, and distributed networks. And these are just the idea of some elites gathering together to allocate who owns what in the realm of